Hello, Mage fans, and welcome to Mage the podcast that works hard towards ascension so you don't have to. I'm your host, Adam Simpson, and I am joined today by my trustworthy co-host, Terry Robinson. Just keep your hands where I can see them. Thank you very much. And today we're on Tomes of Magic. We're going to be talking about a friendly little book about making friends and having a positive outlook on life called Blood Treachery. But before we get into the book, Terry, do we have any announcements worth mentioning?
I have what I'm going to call an aspirational announcement, because you and I are essentially machines that turn coffee into podcasts. The project I am working with the YouTube personality, the Primogen, who does Vampire the Masquerade explainers, and we are attempting to do an explainer of crossovers that have occurred between mage and vampire. So basically it's going to be Lilith, then nothing for several millennia, Tremere, then nothing for several hundred years, and then the modern knights. And that'll be on YouTube, and once that exists, I will share that link with everyone, and it's going to consist of a Northern European gentleman working from a script very concisely, saying interesting things, and then me. So I look forward to seeing how that ultimately turns out. Also, we are doing an interview with the author of this book, Stephen Michael DePesa, about his experience writing this and other revised books. When I contacted him, he said, "You do know that was 20 years ago?" And I'm like, uh-huh. He's like, "You expect me to remember anything from 20 years ago?" Uh-huh. And there seems to be some sort of mind time effect that affects all mage authors, that initially they all go, "I don't remember any of that." And then you say like three things to them, and they're like, "I have a 45-minute fascinating story that involves the editor of that book, which I will now share with you." So I'm hoping that magical effect continues to work. And those are my announcements.
All right, great. Well, today on Tones of Magic, we're discussing the revised edition book, Blood Treachery. We are still in the year 2000. This book clocks in at 93 pages and was written by Scott Cohen and Stephen Michael DePesa. And this book describes a violent conflict between the Order of Hermes and Clan Tremere of the Camarilla vampires. So first off, we're going to start with a walkthrough of the book to get ourselves situated, and in the process, we'll have some comments on each chapter, and then towards the end, we'll break out into a general discussion of the book and some adventure ideas. So, Terry, can you get us started?
I will. This book continues revised tradition of opening fiction that really tells you what the book is going to be about. We get a prelude, which is a character obviously dealing with blood hunger, the withdrawal that comes from somebody who consumes either a vampire that consumes mortal vitae, which is to say blood, or a mortal that consumes vampire vitae, having the shakes, as it were, from not consuming it recently. Character in question can see the damage that's occurring to their avatar from this harmful practice, and then we get the idea that there is some insider deal where this character is getting blood in exchange for information, with the ultimate hope that they will be able to use this as a tool to rule over the Order of Hermes. And we're not quite sure necessarily what house the person is from. Titleist. It's Titleist. It's very obviously someone from House Titleist. And we then get the story of a raid on a Tremere chantry. The Tremere call their little gathering places chantry as well, and things don't quite go as we think they're going to.
It does do a very good job of helping people understand what this book is going to focus on, and it sets the mood of betrayal and mistrust quite well, which is probably the major theme of this book. Yeah, the revised edition preludes really are so far quite spot on. It's nice to see.
Then we get our customary short introduction, and normally I don't really say much about these, except for this one includes two important notes. One, the World of Darkness at this point has been around for something like 10 years, and your characters may be Methuselahs when it comes to knowledge of vampires, but your characters won't be. And one of the recurring ideas in the book is how little each group understands about the other. It really seems like it's going to become a comedy of matters at a certain point, but that is prevented by the fact that there's a lot of shotgun blasts going off. The other thing it includes is a disclaimer for angry gamers that says, this changes a bunch of stuff. Use it or don't. We don't care. We're not going to tell you. And I like the fact that it says this story is official, and it puts official in air quotes. like after 10 years of mage books, the writers would be able to tell a mage table what is true and what is not true. So I kind of like the fact that they were kind of recognizing that maybe their job of dictating canon is something that most mage players would not take. And they tell you what the major themes are. The idea is in Revised, they want to make the traditions less stagnant, and a war with vampires is one way to do it. Now, the first half of this book does a thing we haven't really seen before in Mage. We've gotten introductory long pieces of fiction to explain in-world things. I think Horizon's Stronghold of Hope was probably the one with the longest, where that had a 20 or 30 page thing where it was Dante solves everything, and also visits various places in Horizon. Act 1, Wizard's March, opens with a dramatis personae where it lists all of the characters that are going to appear in what to me felt like a Greek tragedy. We have a chorus in the form of the oracles who assemble and say what is going to happen. They describe the state of the world, that the earth is at capacity, the moon is bereft of meaning because the technocracy has perpetrated the idea that it's a lifeless rock. We get an idea that the oracles long for home, but they are banned because of the Avatar storm. The players enter, and we get a recitation of the original houses of the Order of Hermes. I was pleased to hear this because my personal favorite house, Gerbaton, who's like, sure, we could settle this problem with Curtimane, or we could duel using the age-old medium of cheese plates, is one of my favorites. Also, shout out to fan favorite House Kriamon. We get a very quick reminder of what Tremere did. Tremere in the, I think, 10th century or 11th century, felt that magic was becoming more constrictive. He was afraid of dying, and to escape the bonds of death, that magic would no longer allow him to escape, despite the fact that within canon we have several dozen examples of other mages who have lived 1,000 years past this point. Let's not get caught up in details. Tricks Quasitator to attack Diadne to distract from the fact that he had come up with some sort of hermetic ritual to turn himself into a vampire. There is a war that occurs between the Tremere and the rest of the Order of Hermes. That war consumes a lot of the Hermetic's resources, and it kind of suggests that if Tremere hadn't been treacherous, the Order of Reason wouldn't have risen. That there was some set of circumstances that allowed the Order of Reason to destroy Mistridge. That's explained a little bit later. And I thought that was a heck of an eye raiser to be like, oh, by the way, this one little treachery eventually broke everything, which continues the theme in Old World of Darkness of something bad happened a while ago, and this is why we're not allowed to have nice things. We get the stage being set, which reminds us that Duizatep and Mus have fallen, and the most powerful mages in the Order have disappeared, but they still do have a few masters running around. One of the characters listed is Ishak ibn Thoth, and that's kind of interesting because that's one of the few archmasters running around. And we get more information about that in the Order of Hermes tradition book. And then we get a set of opening scenes. And more or less what this outlines is what is the state within the Order of Hermes. It starts with a bunch of characters talking about how ritual magic isn't working properly. Nicodemus Mulhouse mentions that, hey, if you want the original copy of the book that you're trying to find, that was taken with House Tremere, and no one would go attack them. And whenever you tell a mage that no one's done something, they go try and do it. We get a quick cutaway to some group of Hermetic mages in the Black Forest of Germany talking about what it took to take down Zapathasura, the risen antediluvian of the Ravnos clan, that it took 3 nukes, a set of orbital mirrors, and this is kind of the moment where the Hermetics say, we've lost. One, who knew the Technocracy had the resources to deploy literally $1 trillion set of space mirrors? Also, if this is just one vampire, what the heck are we going to do? And they interpret this as the vampires having gotten very powerful, despite the fact this being one of like a handful of antediluvians. Cuts back to Exeter Chantry, which becomes another recurring place, and there is a group of students who find that one of their cabal mates has been attacked by a vampire, and they kind of think that this would be a good cover to attack the vampires, steal their stuff, and swear vengeance, and everybody wins. this works its way up to a fever pitch quite quickly, and at a grand tribunal of the primi of the Hermetic houses, there is an argument over whether the judgment on House Tremere was ever actually done. They were tried in absentia, and they were told, people who've already left that we haven't seen, you're bad, you need to leave. And that Wizard's March should be declared to reclaim the lore. Titulus falls in behind this idea quickly. Ishak ibn Thoth feels that he doesn't have any choice but to agree with it. And this single attack very quickly bubbles up to the Order of Hermes deciding to attack the vampires. To which the oracles quite simply say, shit, we're doomed. And one of the oracles is like, maybe not. And all the other ones are like, no, we're doomed. We also get a list of what the state of the houses of the Order of Hermes are. And I think Adam is going to walk us through that.
Yeah, for this book, they wanted to show how the Order of Hermes has changed even since the beginning of Revised Edition. And so they give us a snapshot over the course of 2 pages on where are the houses now. So what we have is, starting off with Bonasagus. The influential leaders died when Doisatep fell. The remaining members have emerged from their sanctums and are rethinking their methods. Mostly young mages now, they are becoming more active in the order while devising new avenues of research. They are talking with House Thig now to gain fresh perspectives. Ex Miscellanea, largely passed over in the past, this house is now gaining acceptance. They are being brought into more discussions and trying to see what their new role in the order will be. Criamon mages, a former house that was absorbed into Ex Miscellanea, are going insane and dying. A few have recovered and no one understands the phenomenon. Flambeau, these mages are upset by the recent chaos and setbacks. They want to risk an offensive against the Technocracy. This house is actively fighting adversaries of all stripes and has an attrition rate so high it probably can't be maintained. Nearly half of all initiates to the order are sent to Flambeau. Fortuné, now the busiest house in the order, managing finances and working hard to recruit as many new initiates as possible. They can't continue the research as they'd like. Their arts are doing better than most other houses, as they rely on mathematics and newer theories. Even now, these mages are lucky. Fortuné being lucky. Who would have thought? Janissary, Chiron Mustai, their strong leader, is dead, and the house has lost direction. They continue their secretive ways and have found a new leader. Ali Ben Shamaz follows an extremist philosophy, and his leadership may cause the house to be folded into Ex Miscellanea if things continue as they are. Quaesitor, although the current situation is a great time to rise to prominence, this house works to continue its mission of dispensing justice objectively. Hermetics wonder if the members of this house can still work the Gilgal ritual that punishes criminal mages. Shea, this house is remaining calm while the others panic. They are continuing their translation work and historical research. They wonder if the current crisis is really the end of days. Solificati, now a house in the Order of Hermes, this group is pursuing their goal of mystic unity. Their alchemy worked well in current times, and the fresh ideas of their younger members bode well for their future. Thig, maturing in recent days, this new house's odd ideas are giving the order a much-needed edge. Their magic is working well in the current environment. They're the second largest house since their arts appeal to younger recruits. And finally, we have Titulus. This house's emphasis on strength through conflict went too far, and now they are a shadow of their former self. Few initiates trickle in while members disagree on how to solve their problems. Now, some members are pushing for a shocking new plot that may tear the whole house down.
And what did you think about that introductory chapter 1?
Again, I don't like how they're constantly communicating this idea that Doisatep was the only chantry or the only chantry worth mentioning for the entire Order of Hermes. There were always supposed to be a number of chantries, and the old adage of don't put all your eggs in one basket, I mean, I think every mage faction is going to keep that in mind. They say, in this book, Doisatep fell, there goes our library. It's like, yeah, you should have broken that up, put it in more than one place. I mean, I realize some volumes were put into Horizon, but one, Horizon was attacked and really trashed, and two, it's been hinted at in a couple of recent books that the Order of Hermes didn't want their good stuff to go to Horizon. I also wanted to say that if you go back to first edition and look at Book of Chantries, Doisatep was a mixed place. It wasn't just Hermetic mages. There were a lot of non-Hermetic mages part of cabals and living there as long-term residents. But when you look at Doisatep in later mage books, they really make it sound like, that was just Hermetics there. It was a very Hermetic place, and that's all that was going on there. So I can see the idea of wanting to recover treasures from House Tremere that were taken long ago, but for one, how do they know that the Tremere has so much of their good stuff? And two, what is the proof that they still have it today. I mean, it's been a long time, and vampires are pretty different from mages. It seems kind of odd that they just automatically say, they took lots of our good stuff, and they all still have it, and they're preserving it really well, just waiting for us to go and grab it. I don't know, it seemed a little artificial to me. We see that the person who's really causing problems is this Hermetic Titleist mage named Marcus, and he's a master. Darn it, if it doesn't teach us in Revised Edition that all masters are bad news. I mean, we just went through a couple of books saying there's very few masters now, there's not many left, they're not worth worrying about anymore, and now we've got this big problem, and there's a master at the heart of it. Boy, I think when you get your 5th dot in any sphere, you just become evil. You're lost, you're hopeless.
Yeah, you think that you can't have a sphere rating higher than your Rite, you actually can't have a sphere rating higher than your idiotic asshole rating. So, which is why no one likes dealing with archmages. It's one of those things where, like, it's slightly artificial, but I wish they had done a little more explaining up front, where they're like, the order feels like they've just been kicked, and now they need to do something big to show that they're still in charge or important or something like that. I think we've all kind of dealt with or seen scenarios where we thought someone was down for the count, which is when people can often be the most dangerous. It's where you use low expected value, high variance strategies. That's when you start throwing your Hail Marys, as it were. And this kind of felt like one of those cases, like everything's going bad for us, and this is like a last ditch effort to do something. And that's one of those things where the book is like, yes, we're going to bring this up and then explain why 55 pages later. We're good authors. So Act 2 is called The Hidden War, and this shows the buildup of the back and forth between the two groups. Rather than listing each of the scenes, some of which are quite short, it shows an initial raid against a vampires and vice versa. And scene 1 opens on a dying mage and a dying vampire who is about to embrace the sunlight, as it were. The rosy fingers of dawn, I believe, are the figure of speech that are used. And the war has begun. A cabal is sweeping through a chantry. They are looking for books. They are ignoring their own wounded. They keep getting whiffs that there's this massive node, and they're like, oh man, here's the vampire's node. And it turns out that massive store of quintessence that seems to be moving around, that's kind of hard to find, is a giant vampire. Which is interesting because it suggests that mages can detect vampires based on their blood, which I think is an interesting systematic point, and I don't know if I would allow that in my game, but still. We go back to the Chantry, where the books have been recovered. There's only one survivor. Didn't get what the Order wanted, told to keep silent. They discover that blood is the source of the vis that they had detected, or the quintessence, and they think that the vampires need quintessence, not realizing what it truly is. We go back to the vampire side, where they're surveying the scene, and a elder is attacked and a gargoyle defends it. And then we get one of the creepier sections where our friend Marcus is dissecting a vampire. And this is one of the most stone cold sections in Mage, where if you're going to invoke the icy flaw, this was a great example of it, where he just matter-of-factly dissects this still unliving creature. It is quite graphic. Someone notes that the Mage Chantries and the Tremere Chantries are very similar, and kind of at the apex, Marcus realizes that the power is held inside of the blood and can grant terrible potency. We get shady indications that there are still some people around that remember when Tremere was still a part of the Order of Hermes. Some former Tremere, or a character listed as former Tremere, tires of the bloodshed and withdraws during another raid instead of staying to fight, saying nothing we had here was that important. There's a suggestion that someone still older will be displeased, and the act ends with the destruction of this London chantry that we had been following along. There's a lot of explosions, and one of the characters, Rebecca, is told that to save the Order, they need to end the war. The overwhelming theme of this chapter was misunderstanding, was each group not knowing what the other group could do or what they were up to. The vampires were like, tell us who your sire is, and the mages are like, what the dink? And the mages are like, tell us where you keep your quintessence, and the vampires are like, we have literally no idea what you're talking about. Misunderstanding all around, and then a war within each group's higher ups to figure out, is this our opportunity to crush the opposition, or is this something we need to end before we are completely exhausted?
Well, with Act 2, really with the first 3 chapters, it was kind of like reading an example of someone else's story to give you ideas. And I felt like, okay, there's some utility there, but it's different from like reading a World of Darkness source book. It was kind of a very different feel for me. But I wanted to take a moment just to talk about the framing device for the first 3 chapters of this book, which is watching a live play. I thought that was interesting for me. It's something that is certainly a very different framing device from the ones we have had in the past. I got the sense that it was like a outdoor medieval play, which of course is pretty closely connected to the earlier classical Greek plays where the actors are all standing outside, they're dressed simply. Instead of having elaborate costumes that they can change through between scenes, they have masks on, and that makes it easier for people sitting farther back in the audience to sort of recognize who the character is or what sort of character he is. Oh, that one's a soldier, that one's the main character, just by their masks. I wish they would have leaned into it a little bit because they got very heavy with the special effects. I mean, one example is the masks that the characters use in this play are colored. White is, regular people, sleepers. Purple is mages. Red is vampires. And then if you see a mask that is red and white, that is a ghoul, that is a regular person who's been turned into a ghoul by being given vampire blood from a vampire. A mage who has ingested vampire blood and becomes sort of a ghoul mage. Their masks are red and purple. And they describe in here how the masks are striped. I thought it would have been simpler to have it like half one color, half the other. And it talks about these subtle effects of when something happens in the story, stripes suddenly appear, or this color turns darker, or this color turns lighter. It was very special effecty, like some sort of weird cross of a medieval play and a modern movie. I think it would have been handier to just say, why don't you say that the actor takes off the white mask and puts on a mask that is half red and half white. It would stick with the theme a little bit better. And I started wondering, just my own speculation, but why is it that they chose a framing device this unique and this, I guess you could say, classical? One idea is that the people writing this book may have wanted to express the idea that the Order of Hermes is hopelessly stuck in the past. They're stuck in outmoded thinking from hundreds of years ago, and so that's why we're showing this as a medieval-style, outdoor, low-budget play.
Yeah, I very much get the sense when I was reading through that one of the problems in Revised and one of the reasons the traditions ran into difficulties was they've always been fighting the same wars. The Order of Hermes was a particularly clear example of how that could be shown. And to me, I interpreted it as a Greek drama, quite simply because I'm not familiar with medieval dramas at all. And it very much struck me as the problems that mages have faced, even though it is, in this case, the year 2000, and we are hinging on Ascension / Gehenna / the Apocalypse / the Long Winter / the Sixth Great Maelstrom or what have you. The problems mortals face haven't really changed over time. It is partially particularly tragic for it to be the Hermetics, because we just got off of an edition where it's like, oh, the Hermetics came up, they're assholes, which is one of the recurring criticisms on the presentation of the Order of Hermes. This one gives us a little bit of hope on what that can do, but at the same time, it's like, yep, this again. So how about that?
Yeah, so either it shows that they're outmoded in their thinking, or it shows that there's a timeless quality to the conflicts taking place. So that's some speculation on that one.
Act 3 is the culmination of this, and I thought was pretty good. We see the ashes of the Exeter Chantry. Marcus is then meeting with someone and pressing a trade of information for blood. He claims to have emerged victorious and leaves with a hearty stash of vampire blood. And then we get a bunch of cutscenes of titleless or titlean mages and apprentices and masters drinking the blood, thinking this is going to be the obvious key to, one, their dominance over the vampires, and two, because of that, their rise within the Order of Hermes to be its new leaders. And that, to me, I found touching in that it was a case of this misconception and not realizing what they're giving up, like very quickly sweeping across a group. So it's one of those things where in Revised, a lot of mages are gone, a lot of masters are gone, a lot of the things across the horizon are gone. So if you have a small group, an idea, it could possibly spread very quickly among them. When you look at it and it shows maybe 3 or 4 cutscenes, that's a not insubstantial percentage of all Hermetics who are being consumed by this misunderstanding, and my heart kind of went out to them as I'm like, oh dear, you're going to lose your avatar. That's a kick in the nuts. And then we go back to a trial that is being held where a Euthanatos mage is arguing that there was a vampire found in a suspicious area that was being ignored, and we get this Master Augustus who intervenes, that breaks in to say that the orders and the traditions are being tested, that this vampire blood is, and the war with the vampires is simply a distraction, and that if the order doesn't do something about it, they're going to be destroyed. And at that moment, the oracles step up from their Greek chorus role and kind of are like, see what this guy said? Really important. And then in kind of one of my favorite scenes where it really stops with the whole play format and you're like, this is just a John Woo movie. Augustus is offered a vial of blood by another character, is about to take it, but is like, dropped it, dives out of the way. Someone from the shadows tries to shoot them. The blood hits the ground and it's all tinkly. He makes his escape. They get into the back of a car and Augustus is like, I'm a master. So obviously I can't deal with this directly. You, with very little powers who can easily be killed, you need to take care of this, which is another recurring theme in Mage. They need to go to Horizon to present what is their evidence to what remains of the Council of the Nine to figure out what to do next. We get a side scene between what to me was a Zamisi vampire and a Hermetic, which kind of suggests that this conflict has spilled out and everyone is now using this as an opportunity to beat up on the Hermetics or beat up on the vampires as they would prefer. We get the revelation that they have some abducted vampire that they are going to bring in front of the council to reveal what has happened. Johann, one of the other mages that is addicted to blood, has a back and forth with the vampire where he's like, are you gonna drink all that blood? And the other vampire's like, if I had the choice to die all over again, I would do so immediately. And he's like, I'm gonna take that as a no, and takes some of the blood, and the other vampire's like, oh dear, this is not a good thing for you. This ends real bad, buddy. And you get this kind of interesting scene where the vampire's like, no, you don't do that. Vampire blood, not even once. Don't do it. This is your avatar. This is your avatar on vampire blood. We get the final scene, which occurs at Horizon, where a ancient vampire reveals itself and just breaks things. This is the vampire equivalent of the scene in Star Wars Rebel 1 where Darth Vader just kills everyone in like 15 seconds.
My favorite part of that movie, but go on.
That movie was so good. It was so good. Favorite Star Wars movie. The ancient vampire is like, why shouldn't I kill all of you? All the masters are like, well, why shouldn't we kill all of you? And then Rebecca comes in and says, stop, you're all being idiots. And we don't get a resolution because the book wants to say there are two ways this could go, and it is up to you. This is the hope of Revised. This could be the point at which the Hermetics realize their error and revitalize themselves, or it could be where they make one last stand for a idiotic idea and wind up destroying themselves. And the choice is yours. And that kind of ends the Greek tragedy. What'd you think about Act 3?
I thought Act 3 was certainly very dramatic. There was a lot of descriptions of consumption of vampire blood.
Yes.
Being the mature podcaster that I am, my mind naturally ran back to an old Penny Arcade joke, online comic strip from a couple of years ago where two characters are discussing something and the other says, you know what? I don't drink anything that comes out of people. Just a personal policy. Served me well. Going to stand firm on that one. I'll put a link to that one in the show notes for anyone who wants to read it, but I just kept thinking of that and chuckling. I was struck by how, at first, how crooked House Titulus was. I mean, they looked like a bunch of really, backstabbing villains. And I was thinking back to just within Mage, not Ars Magica, but within Mage, previous material about Titulus. And this is kind of a new take on it. But then I think it was also supposed to show how after the Avatar Storm, there's much less of House Titulus than there was before. And one or two people can become very, very influential upon it. And so I don't think it's trying to say that House Titulus was always this crooked and underhanded. It's just it has quickly become that way now because a very influential figure took it down that path. But other than that, I think I'm ready for Chapter 4.
Chapter 4 is called Pawns and Bishops and explains what just happened. This is the storytelling and information chapter before we get to the appendix, and it breaks it down into a few sections. The first is called The Sleep of Ages, and basically explains what the status kind of thinking is within the Order of Hermes. And it says that reality has become exhausted. And I thought to myself, oh, wow, that's a play on words, because they could mean it in one of two senses. And then later on in the same paragraph, they go, when we say reality is exhausted, we mean it in two different senses. And I'm like, damn it, I thought I was clever. And they say, one, the force of stasis is tightening. And the other is that reality is tired. There's just not enough of it to support all the crazy things that are happening. Mages are panicking because things have stopped working, and it describes the four kind of reactions that Hermetics and many other mages have taken. And it breaks it up into the broken, those who've thrown in the towel and are like, screw it, I'm not doing magic anymore. The web cutters, who are using the tools of the technocracy against it. They're becoming very technologically inflected and working very subtly, which they say is ultimately not going to be successful because it's very hard to destroy the technocracy with its own tools. The transcendentalists, who are doubling down on their personal paradigm, and what they refer to as the bombs. They are going out in spectacular blazes of magical glory, or they are becoming marauder or going into quiet. The book says, what do you do? And it says there is a middle path that we need to be able to balance between these. And mage has always been a question of balance, but it is the case that you are trying to get people with exceptionally strong wills, with exceptionally specific ideas of what they think is the way that magic should be done, to learn moderation. We then get a section on role-playing and storytelling within the Hermetics, and this gives a pretty fascinating breakdown of what modern Hermeticism kind of leans on. We get some misconceptions and an idea of what Hermetics give up to be Hermetics. And quite simply, Hermetics think their magic is amazing because it's been tested and has a very long lineage. They are arrogant almost out of noblesse oblige. They know that they are some of the greatest mages to have ever existed. They provided most of the resources required to create the Council of the Nine outside of the actual membership in terms of quintessence and artifacts and leadership and so on. Their magic focuses on the idea that they must master the magic. And it gives a short section where it talks about other traditions view themselves as conduits, where a dream speaker or verbena, at least in the Hermetic eyes, is being driven by their magic. And the Hermetics refuse to allow that to happen, that their personal mastery must be so great that they cannot be controlled by their magic. And they kind of view what other people do as being weak-willed and lesser and lacking the exactitude and control that they do. And their big thing is Hermetics demand respect, and they will only respect others who have earned it, which makes sense. It has a short section on misconceptions, that the Hermetics aren't always the bad guys, that they're not just technocrats with wands. But it does say, yes, the Hermetics do set policy for the traditions, partially because that kind of political maneuvering is something they're really good at, and also because no one else really wants to do it. In the same way that in the Technocracy, the New World Order takes care of all the internal documentation, both because they're super good at it and because no one else wants to take care of it, and that gives them disproportionate power in some people's minds. The next main section that we encounter is something called Wizard's March, where it talks about how the tone of this plot that you can run is desperation and ignorance, and that everyone has slightly different motivations for why they want the Wizard's March to occur, and it has coalesced into this massive, terrible idea. It could be a quest for power, or advancement within the Order, or vengeance, or desperation, but all of those are options. The other thing that they note is, since there are so many attacks occurring from Tremere chantries on Hermetic chantries and vice versa, this is like the one time where on this side of reality, Order of Hermes mages get to get away with coincidental high ritual magic. And part of the popularity of the war, they say, is the fact that Hermetics in this one case get to use their arts without fear in a world that has otherwise strongly punished them for trying to use their magic. It has a useful sidebar that basically says, you can use this as a vampire story, but it's hard. You should really pick mage or vampire and run with this. And includes a note that says, yeah, this is huge to the Order of Hermes, and it may be kind of notable to the Tremere, but vampires on the whole are probably not going to notice this happening. And that was one of those, but I love mage, why aren't they in charge of everything? And it's a big world of darkness full of a lot of werewolves and vampires, and mages at the end of the day sometimes just aren't the most important kids on the street, but they always are to me. We get a section on the temptation in the fall, and it talks about kind of the key points of the non-mechanical use of vampire blood, that the players know it is a terrible choice, but the characters in general do not. That you need to focus as a storyteller on the incredibly intense high that this creates. There's nothing that compares to it. And that you need to play up the benefits to the player of instant strength, of instant vitality, of not aging, and that this sudden power causes great problems with Titulus, because they ultimately will need to choose between rooting out the corruption within their own house or destroying the order in the process. The last section we get is kind of on what other groups would think about this. And it talks about how the Chorus, the Akashic Brotherhood, the Verbena, and the Euthanatoi are likely going to be Hermetic allies because, in general, they're not huge fans of vampires. The Cult of Ecstasy probably skirts the edges as time mages. They're like, maybe this isn't going to work out too well. The Dream Speakers are divided, and they don't like the idea of mages kind of mucking around in other supernatural entities' business. They worry that this will set the precedent that they're going to interfere with the Garu and disrupt their very fragile but slightly cordial relationship there, and that the Society of Ether and the Virtual Adepts may only be involved on the personal level. The Technocracy in general usually leaves vampires alone. I mean, vampires are kind of represented as the strongest force of stasis within the world of darkness, at least past first edition. But that the Technocracy, after the event in India, may be like, maybe it is time to start being more active. And it makes mention that others within the technocrats instead think that this is the last gasp of activity as the consensus tightens and destroys vampires. And it gives kind of some hints on how technocrats would discover this. And they say that it would probably start with the statisticians noticing little blips that they had previously ignored and now starting to unwind that thread, ultimately to find this vast vampire conspiracy in it.
Chapter 4, in a sense, was like the start of the book. When I got to chapter 4 and started reading, I was like, oh yes, great. This is the stuff I was looking for and wanting to read and was hoping would be here. This is where the framing narrative is ceased, and they just start talking as, author to reader. I liked how on the first page of chapter 4, it says, quote, "in the new mage universe," end quote. And it's like, yeah, that actually helps me with a lot of revised edition books because it departs so greatly from the themes, setting, and even concepts of what came before in mage that it does help me to narrow in on revised edition and see it as its own thing. I really liked the section called Praxis Essentiae. We're talking about the Hermetic mindset, why they believe as they believe, why they have the point of view that they do. I thought that was really nice. It was really helpful. It was one of the more balanced look at why do the Hermetics proceed this way in their affairs. Of course, I would also, as Terry said, mention that when we did the Tomes of Magick episode for the first Order of Hermes tradition book, we took some time to talk about the Hermetic point of view and how it is different from other traditions in the Council of Nine. So that might be something you want to review if you would like to hear more on that topic. But basically, the Praxis Essentiae section was, I thought, very high quality and very helpful for people who want to work with more Order of Hermes NPCs or player characters. I liked the section encouraging people to go ahead with vulgar magic or more flashy kinds of magic when you are in a Hermetic chantry or sanctum, or when you invade a Tremere chantry. Then, yeah, those things are going to be coincidental that would normally be vulgar. And so this is a great place for you to have a change of pace for your revised era chronicles, where instead of such heavy paradox and such low-key magic that is the norm, can instead be traded in for something more violent, more dramatic, more flashy. And I think that could be a lot of fun for your players to have that switch. Not probably a long-term thing you're going to do, but just for those scenes, for that story within your chronicle. And last, made the mention of you could do it differently than when you've portrayed it in this book. You could have a slow conflict, a war between Tremere and the Order of Hermes that builds a little bit more slowly, where they send their servants after each other, or they try to take out each other's servants. You could have acolytes and ghouls getting whacked in dark alleys at night. And I really liked that idea. When I started thinking of a slow burn kind of conflict, I got all these really cool ideas for things I could do in my chronicle. So I appreciated that section. But
well, someone think of the Custos.
yeah.
And this is where, as all true Made to the Ascension fans, which is to say the people who just want rotes and dots and stuff, which is me half the time, this is where the book starts, the appendix. It starts on a big section called, No, You Can't Have a Ghoul Mage Revenant. Bad. No. This section starts off with Ghoul Mages, where the blood is foul. It contains the most hideous resonance as each ounce of it is stolen from something else. But it's addictive, and will probably require a willpower roll to deal with. Benefits. Automatic success on strength rolls. And yes, kids, that includes damage. It can be used as quintessence. It's got pretty foul resonance, which may incline your mages towards maybe not the most shiny, happy magic that has ever been done, but still, quintessence is quintessence at a certain point. Also, you can learn cool-ass vampiric disciplines, which it describes as basically 1 or 2 dot sphere effects that generate no paradox that you have to learn from a vampire and cost 25 experience a piece. But again, no paradox. And when paradox is like slapping you around, that's a super cool effect to be able to pull out. Downsides, everything about this is bad all the time. Wait,
you're saying I shouldn't do this? Come on, man. My weekend plans are wrecked now.
Exactly. This is way more hazardous than the previous best addictive substance in Mage, cocaine. I like how, they're trying to soft pedal how awesome vampire blood is systematically, and they're like, one of the downsides is when you stop taking it, the fact that you don't age anymore reverses. And I'm like, I don't know if that's a downside. That's one of those things where it's like, yes, if you stop doing a thing that gives you a benefit, you lose that benefit. I'm not going to call that a downside. Anyway, but eventually it starts chewing up points of permanent willpower. It is highly addictive. It gives you systems for the willpower rolls that you need to succeed in to not become addicted. And then at some point, your avatar will also get addicted, which is independent and much harder to deal with. That you can consume a number of pints equal to your avatar rating before your avatar is going to be like, more of the red stuff? Not feeling it? Well, guess what? Deal with it or you don't get magic. That after a longer period of time, it starts burning through your avatar rating, and then it starts burning through your arete, as it is already burning through your willpower. That you get the addicted flaw, which you don't get to buy off, but needs to be overcome eventually with a seeking if you would like to do that. And the character sees their tortured avatar more often being torn away and desiccated. Also, you are a glowing beacon of rot and corruption in the eyes of demons. And I'm like, oh, that's a downside I hadn't really considered before. And the blood bond makes it very hard for mages to escape. The blood bond is if you consume the blood of a specific vampire 3 times, you bound to them. They, your dominator, they're anything that they tell you to do that is short of go kill yourself is very hard to resist doing. Any willpower rolls you make against them is done at half willpower. And then it has a section, as I said before, entitled No Revenants. And a revenant in vampire lore is basically a line of ghouls that has been a vampiric ghoul for long enough that their blood generates its own vitae. So it has an aside where it's like, what do you mean I don't get to be a mage that also has super strength and access to all the vampiric disciplines without having to consume the blood of another vampire? And it kind of walks through the math, and it's like, there's probably 2 sane mage revenants on the face of the planet, and you're not one of them. Which is interesting because one of the recurring themes in Revised was yeah, these systems are well designed. If you want to have a character that has all their eggs in this one particular basket, go nuts. And this is kind of the one case where they're like, no superhero mages. We get a short section on the interaction between mage magic and vampiric magic. And this is something that we have talked about before, but I really like the way they presented it here. And they broke it down to the idea that as long as both are dealing within a paradigm of high ritual magic, as long as you're dealing with thaumaturgy or Tremere rituals against Hermetic and other high ritual magics, it is essentially a war between the static power represented by this ancient vampire possibly, and the stasis represented in the consumption of blood to sustain oneself against the dynamic will of the mage. And it gives you a little system on how to try and resolve that. And I just really liked that as an idea because it gave you a cosmological idea of what happens when these two type of night folk are resisting each other's powers. It also makes a point to say, yeah, in your world, mages may just be able to trounce on vampires, but it kind of gives you a thing like vampires are special, and if mages were so amazing, they would have wiped out vampires long ago, but obviously they haven't, so there has to be, vampires have to have some pretty potent powers to bring to this fight. It also has an aside on how hard it is for mages to undo the curse, and that undoing the curse of empirism is kind of not the point of the game. It also has one of my favorite asides where it's like, the curse was cast by God. Can you roll more successes than God? And the answer is yes, because in Dark Ages, Moses ben Maimonides, also known as Rambam, was able to reverse vampirism. So apparently at least one person was able to roll more successes than God. And and then we get to, I think, the sleeper hit of this book, where it's like, you know the way we haven't given you any information about the Umbral Courts, and we said that we never would, and we really don't like that we're doing this, but here's a bunch of information about the Umbral Courts, and I'm like, hot dog, Umbral Courts. And it talks about how Hermetic magic is about dealing with, in many cases, the angelic courts and a number of other umbral courts. And it mentions that spirits generally don't like vampires. They stick out like a sore thumb in the penumbra. When they do make their way into the spirit world, the spirits really don't like it. They're kind of this sucking void of stasis and entropy, which no one really wants to have. They're like the stinky kid, as it were. No one really wants to hang around with them. And that spirits may be more willing to loan their power to a mage if it's going to wind up killing some bloodsuckers. And it walks us through the 4 archangel courts, which are tied to the elemental courts. And it makes an interesting note where it says, even the jagglings of the angels are potent and cannot be easily bound. That your best bet is to just bargain with them and to make a traditional agreement. That all umbral courts have a tie to one of the 4 brothers presented here. In addition to that, we get a few other archetypes. One is that there is an umbral court of the tarot. And I'm like, yes, more of this. And it mentions that the goddess has one of the biggest sets of influences within that court, and that is tied probably to Gaia's umbral court, which I think the werewolves would be pretty fascinated to find out about. We get the information about the courts that are trafficked with Nefandi. And again, these are the high umbral courts that they would be dealing with, as opposed to other forms of demons that we get maybe from either the Outer Dark or from the Underworld. We also get the Zodiacal Court, that it is literally determined by your zodiac and are very good at answering questions of destiny. But they point out one of the subtle benefits of dealing with the zodiac is it's printed in newspapers. Like, so to say that this is esoteric or something that sleepers would find ridiculous, one of the benefits of dealing with the zodiacal courts is they are probably one of the most coincidental and accepted of them. And then we get a bunch of rotes, of which I'm at least going to list that some of my favorite are, one, the initial rote where if you lie to someone, you get electrical shocks. So we get the idea of Ring of Truth, which is the Entropy 1 effect, which is someone can detect if you're lying. And this one goes one step further. It's called Oathbreaker's Lash, which when you cast this effect, if someone lies to you, they also take forces damage, which is that hermetic subtlety I have come to know and love. We also get the idea of the Book of Whispers, which is a book that reads someone's mind and is a pretty great way of creating material to compromise or blackmail someone. But my final favorite is Thunder's Gauntlet, which allows you to challenge someone to Curdomane at a distance, where basically it allows you to super yell and go, "Hey, I have a bone to pick with you." And using the power of correspondence in mind, it goes out and finds that person and says, "Hey, this guy has a bone to pick with you." And that if you want to, you can combine it with Prime or Matter or Life to also have it like light their pants on fire or do something else suitably impressive. We get a few touches on what modern Hermeticism looks like, which are some interesting cases of it saying, hey, how do we reinterpret traditional Hermetic rotes in modernity? And one of the examples it gives is the idea of reinterpreting the golden apples of Hesperides, or how the idea of the butterfly effect could be used. We get a afterword from the authors, and then finally a little bit of suggested reading. And that brings it to a close with a page in notes.
There's a lot of good material in here, and this is the section that storytellers are going to be referencing after they have finished reading the book when they're running games. And so it's important to have a really nice appendix in most of these mage books. And I think they did a pretty good job of pulling this one together. I like how at the start of this chapter they give basically an alternate to using vampire disciplines. And that is traditionally when you're going to mix vampires and mages, you have to get the rule books for both, and then you have to give yourself sort of a crash course, a refresher course on how do vampire disciplines work and how do I lay out an NPC stat sheet for a vampire. And instead they say, well, how about you just drop that cram course and instead use these sort of alternate rules for representing vampire disciplines. And I thought, okay, yeah, for those who would like that, I think that is a really great idea. I like having that sort of light rules alternate there for storytellers so they don't have to do all that homework. The notion that a mage's avatar gets addicted to vampire blood, that was an odd idea for me. That was another example of Revised Edition taking a very different look at avatars than what we've seen before. It seems to make avatars much more immediate and much more of a direct effect on mages in their daily lives. And so I was wondering how I might consider that. Of course, the restrictions on a mage who turns himself into a ghoul were, of course, very, very strict. Let's see, one of them was when you get off the stuff, not only do you resume where you left off in terms of aging, but it's like you rapidly catch up. So it's like you can actually lose years of life if you ingest the vampire blood for so long and then stop. And so that was, just one example of the many very, very strict restrictions they put on it. I was wondering if some of these might be a little too strict. I'm not sure if I would emphasize every one of these. I thought it was amusing when I read the section about no Revenant mages. Absolutely not. Revenant is a concept from the Vampire the Masquerade game where vampires have basically not only made ghouls by giving vampire blood to a regular human, they get some powers, like weaker powers. They can operate during the day, and the vampire can boss them around very effectively. But they went from that, they took it a step further, and they said, look, let's have a couple of ghouls. Let's force them to have children, and then we will cultivate our own family lines of ghouls. And a number of vampires did it so successfully that it eventually reached the point where after enough generations, ghouls were just naturally born, so that you had individuals, a revenant, who was never given vampire blood, yet somehow his body makes its own weaker vampire blood. So the revenants have some vampire powers, but weaker than actual vampires. And so the idea here is, what if a revenant were to awaken? They have ghoul powers without technically being a ghoul, and they also have sphere magic, and wouldn't that be cool? And so they have this big, long section saying, no, don't do that. It's awful. It's terrible. It's the wrong themes. It's the wrong understanding. It's statistically impossible. And I felt like, it's like, look, you could have put one sentence in here and say, because of the way revenants are, they can't awaken. It's like, hey, we're done. No Revenant mages. Solved. Page 80 had a section, Magic and Vampires, and it's basically saying, if you really want to emphasize Hermetics versus Tremere, and you're doing a story or even a whole chronicle about that, then basically you can consider it to be Hermetic Magic versus Hermetic Magic. One is equally effective against the other, and I guess I can see doing that if I was very narrowly focusing on Hermetic mages versus vampires, and if I was focusing more on mage than I was on vampire. And what I mean by that is I want the vampires just to be NPCs who can use thaumaturgy. Thaumaturgy is a vampiric discipline that imitates sphere magic. It's weaker but more reliable. There's no paradox. It's fueled by vampire blood, etc. And so if I was going to use NPC Tremeres in that sense, then I think I would agree with Terry and say these are pretty great rules, this is a pretty great system, make them roughly equivalent, and go with it. If I was going to emphasize the themes of vampire more, then I think I would not use the suggested rules. I think I would make sphere magic more powerful than thaumaturgy. And the reason I would do that is because mages just have sphere magic. Vampires have all these other vampire powers, disciplines, that they can use that are not thaumaturgy, and mages don't know anything about them. They're right out of left field, and a lot of them are surprisingly effective, and of course they don't have paradox. So yeah, if I was going to lean on more of the vampire concepts, then I would certainly disregard this section. But if you're just going to use them as simple thaumaturgy using NPCs and not get into all the details of vampire, then yeah, this is a great section, and I would encourage storytellers to take advantage of it. Yeah, as Terry used the term sleeper hit, which I gotta agree is a good one for the High Umbrud section. There's basically a section in the appendix that says, hey, Hermetics talk to Umbrud from the High Umbra, and so isn't it appropriate that we talk about that for a bit? And I was reading through it, it's like, man, this is probably my favorite part of the book. This is great. This is really nice. It talks about how there are 4 high angels. Each one has an affinity with an elemental category, and these beings are so high and exalted that mages are not going to go and visit a court where 4 of them are sitting there and they can talk to all 4 at once. And a mage probably isn't even going to talk to them one at a time. They're such lofty beings that conversation probably isn't going to take place. So instead, it encourages you to use them as focuses of some rotes and to sort of lean on that idea when using some forces magic, but not necessarily cutting a deal with an archangel. But from there, it steps down to lower levels of High Umbrud that the Hermetic mages would deal with. And I thought it was really nice because it was an alternative. In past mage books, we got the idea that there are umbral courts in the High Umbra. There's the Western Court, there's the Eastern Court, there's the Lodge in the Sky, which is more indigenous peoples group. So in this it says, look, Hermetic mages focus on ideas from Western culture, Western tradition, so why don't we just take this Western court and enlarge it? We've got different sections of it, different courts, you could say, that they can go and visit. There's one Western court, there's the Zodiac court, there's all these other different powers and groups that they can go and visit. And I thought that was a really great idea. It's an alternative from what we had in the past, but I'm fine with that. Anyone who wants to do something different with the High Umbra, I think the original creators of Mage actually would encourage that rather than discourage. So even if you're not going to read everything in this book, definitely look up this High Umbra section in the appendix. I thought it was just very creative and very interesting. And to round it out, towards the end, we get merits and flaws. In the last couple of revised books and late second edition books, I saw a lot of merits and flaws that just did not appeal to me. But that was not the case here. I saw a number of merits and flaws here that I thought were compelling and that I might want to bring into my games. And they rounded out with some rotes, which is better than rotes we get at the end of a lot of books. I really liked how they had 2 rotes to suggest how you might approach very modern chaos magic, hermetic magic, and both of them seem to suggest a more general approach. Basically, you're playing with probabilities rather than doing something right now. It's going to take a little finesse to really incorporate that into your games, but I think it's a great idea. And also, there were a couple of more traditional, you might say medieval, rotes that Order of Hermes used. I thought those were very flavorful, a lot of fun to work with. You could even adapt them to be sort of thaumaturgy thing that some Tremere vampire might use. One that I thought was fun was the Hermes brand. You're basically branding your own blood so that if a vampire attacks you, he'll be sorry. So it's just stuff like that. I thought it was so much Hermetic flavor and so much fun to bring into a chronicle. So definitely worth a look. Liked this appendix.
And with that brings us to the end. What were your thoughts on the book overall?
In the back of my mind, if I'm honest, what I really wanted was a more general look at how you could play with Order of Hermes versus Tremere conflicts. Like if one side started it, or if another side started it, or if they were after X, or if they were after Y, just different ways you could play it. Instead, this book focuses very specifically on one particular conflict that was started for one particular reason, which was, in a nutshell, Order of Hermes says, hey, our magic is not working, we're really in a bind here, vampires are causing some problems with us. Hey, let's go back and find the original editions of the books, not translations, not watered down, he said, she said, but the original old books. The Tremere have a lot of those. We're going to attack the Tremere, get our old books, rebuild our magic from ground zero, and become powerful mages that will do all these wonderful things in the future. So it's nice that we have this excuse to deal with the idea of Order versus Tremere, because that appendix has a lot of great material in it. So I'm glad that we had an excuse to put it into a book and make it available to everybody. But I just would have liked a more general treatment of the subject rather than one that was so finely focused. The other thing is themes. When I first started reading this book, my reaction as a mage fan was, why would the Order of Hermes attack the Tremere? after the Avatar storm. I mean, when they're so weak, when they're so few in number, when all the decks are stacked against them so dramatically, why would they start a fight with someone who isn't even bothering them? And there are like a couple of places in this book where they try to say, hey, look, we know it sounds unlikely, but we think it'd be a really great idea, and that's why we want to emphasize these possible reasons. And what really you need to understand when you approach this book is the idea of basic themes in Revised Edition. There is a special image and logo on the front and back of this book that says Year of Revelations. And that was the idea that the end of the world is coming soon. It's going to be dramatic. It's going to be awful. People are panicking. Things are going to hell in a handbasket. And isn't that a dramatic story? And yeah, I agree. It is dramatic. There are two themes running through Revised Edition. One of them is, I guess you could say, hope and change. The Avatar storm was terrible and it caused a lot of problems. But now that we're getting out of the debris and shaking it loose, we are seeing that there's a lot of possibilities. There's a lot of hope for the future. The younger generation has an opportunity they did not have before. We can shake off the problems of the past more easily because the old people who were really into that are no longer in the picture. And then we have this other theme of final nights. The end of the world is coming and everything's terrible. And so these two themes both appear in Revised Edition, but most books emphasize one over the other. So the last couple of Revised Edition books that we looked at were dealing with the hope and change theme. Things are looking better now. It's not so bad. We're going to pull it together and look at these great new opportunities. Now this book changes gears and goes into the final nights, which is the end of the world is coming soon. Everybody's desperate. Things look bleak. And that is why people are making really bad decisions. And of course, the book makes it clear to everyone, and I certainly agree, that attacking Tremere vampires when they haven't been bothering you very much is a bad idea. So in the hope and change themes, we have the ideas that things are looking good. 2, player characters and younger mages have a much greater influence on their mage faction. In Final Nights, they ask you to imagine that the player characters do not have a big influence on the Order of Hermes. There are other older people who are leading the Order of Hermes, and they're going to plunge it into a conflict, and the players can't do anything about it, which is, of course, very dramatic and plays in well to the Final Nights theme. That understanding helped me to put this book in focus and understand how to approach it in the way that the authors want me to approach it.
And it's one of those things where, of those two themes, the book can't give you hope. It can give you potential avenues for hope, but the goal in a story is you essentially have the generation of conflicts and then the generation of solutions. You want the book to generate the conflicts for you, and the players and the storyteller then get to come up with their world set of solutions. Once the solutions are handed to you, you no longer have reason to play. So it is one of those things that, to a certain extent, baked into the idea of there being narrative, a book almost of necessity has to provide more problems than it does solutions. The problem we run into is if we don't even get an outline of a solution, then that's an issue. Also, if there are so many problems that are so large, there's no reasonable way to deal with them. It's one of the things that I've gone back and forth about, like, oh, why is everything so dour? To some extent, it needs to be to provide an impetus to play the darn game, because otherwise you can wind up with one of those games that doesn't actually tell you what the game is about or what you need to do. But I like the fact that we have pinned down that despite its reputation, there is a lot of hope baked into Revised. It just doesn't hand you that hope. It doesn't do it for you. I agree that they have our stuff argument is kind of ridiculous. And also, like, this one vampire looked at my girlfriend weird. We should kill them all. It took me a little bit to coalesce around the idea that it's like, yeah, they're kind of grasping at straws and doing desperate things. I think one of the things that annoyed me is they're like, reality is hardening. But if we go back to the revised, like, rules, like, difficulty may be increased by 1. Like if you use the new coincidental rules, and even if you use the new vulgar rules, there is more paradox, but Magick hasn't necessarily gotten harder in a lot of cases, because also we have the introduction of personalized instruments. The Hermetics are ritualists. It's not like they're going to be fast casting all the time out of any of the groups that we have seen before. So to me, the way they present the world and the rules they present don't quite line up. The exception to that may be the fact that, yeah, because of the Avatar Storm, any of your powers that invoke something from across the gauntlet are going to be real messed with, and I get that, but I didn't feel like those two things quite lined up. The art on page 72, which just shows a person kind of sitting and looking at their hands while there is just this field of dead bodies around them, I'm like, oh, this is an interesting avenue. Of the art that we get in Revised, this is one of the ones where I would love to try and track down the original piece. This looks like a Langdon Foss. But I really like this book. They tried something new. We're almost 50 books into Mage. And the fact that there are authors that are still willing to be like, hey, let's present the first half of it like this is a play and use that to reveal the information. I liked the commentary delivered by the oracles as kind of the Greek chorus of saying, this is the pivotal moment, or there is still hope and opportunity for such things. The idea of, instead of having tradition books, having a cycle of books like this, where there's a big world event and then it zooms in on a tradition, that's a what if that would have been fascinating to me. Like, what would the Euthanatos book have looked like, where maybe it gives you an update, but it also says, this is the current status of the hunt for the House of Helikar, or this is how the Celestial Chorus is dealing with the return of angels and demons, or something like that, where maybe we get some crossover information, and maybe we get an updated paradigm, and maybe we get a whole bunch of characters that we can glom onto. I think that would have been cooler than anything. I'm very curious to see what that would have looked like if it continued. It is kind of specific. If you don't want to run vampires, you don't use it. And if you don't have any Hermetics, there may not be a huge amount of information here, but I think it's a fascinating way to give an example of the revised idea that the players are now super important. I think they could have done better work to say, here's how your players could intercede to determine the outcome, but to say there is this big pivotal event that ultimately comes down to what a few not very powerful characters do. You have the figure of Rebecca, who needs to speak truth to power, who literally confronts possibly Tremere, possibly Grimgoth, and says, no, stop. And that is where the story ends in its kind of cliffhanger presentation. I thought was great. And as a World of Darkness fan, we get the implication that one of the things former Tremere is probably Grimgoth, who was one of the founding members of Clan Tremere, who may have brought down the defenses at Mistridge. And I thought that was kind of interesting that we get that little peek into vampire history. It does create another one of the circumstances where, again, in World of Darkness, everything is bad because someone made a bad choice at least 500 years ago, which is kind of a recurring idea in Gothic horror versus personal horror. What you going to do about it? And I thought the writing was real snappy. You had a couple of choice bits. The Hermetics have discovered that bullets were reasonably effective against the undead, less so than against humans, but still, but far from useless. And the opening to Act 2, the Oracle of Spirit says, indeed, 2 Cains stand at this altar, each yearning to butcher the other upon the block. Forces replies, your plowshare, O Cain, has been your sword, and it will reap a bloody harvest. Besides a callback to Isaiah chapter 2, verses 4, I just thought was good wordsmithing. And that continues the punchy writing we get with Revised. This does kind of fall back to some 2E, very preachy writing on how a story should or shouldn't be written. But again, for the first entry that these authors have in the series, I think it's a great start, and I look forward to reading more of their stuff.
Yeah, because of chapters 4 in the appendix, this is definitely a book I want on my shelf, and this is a book I'm going to pull down and look at later. So definitely worth having, and glad it's there. One of the issues that is dealt with head-on repeatedly in this book is requesting player ignorance. In Revised Edition, they emphasize this idea much more strongly than they did in previous editions of Mage. That is, every group in the World of Darkness knows nothing about all the other groups in the World of Darkness. And one of the things I liked more about earlier World of Darkness books in every line is they allowed more knowledge of the other groups. It's like, you're a secret group in a supernatural world, and you've been around for a while, and because of that, you have built up some knowledge. Not complete, not everything, but some knowledge about the other groups, and so that knowledge can inform your interactions with them. But when we get to Revised Edition, they really want to push this idea that's like, no, look, all the factions don't know anything about each other. They're really, really ignorant of each other, and they seem to think that brings about more drama, more interesting stories, and I suppose it has that possibility, but I just want to say, not necessarily. If I was going to be playing with people who were players who were new to the World of Darkness, I might try and get into these stories more, but if I had players who knew more about the World of Darkness in general, I would not insist as a storyteller so strongly on so much ignorant. It can start seeming kind of artificial after a while, and especially when it comes to a group as old as the Order of Hermes. And when talking about vampires, I mean, not only have they been around a long time, but there's a lot of them. There's just a lot of vampires. In previous mage books of all the editions, we keep seeing how mages who live in the city know a thing or two about vampires. There's a lot of them around. They have to deal with them. I think the blood bond is something that mages in general are just going to know something about. And this book kind of hinges on the idea that mages don't know about the blood bond. Take blood from one specific vampire 3 times or more, and there's a blood bond between you. The vampire tells you what to do, and you just have to do it, and you are very, very weak in all attempts to resist commands from that vampire. I think it's something that most mages would kind of catch on to after a few hundred years and a lot of mages living in cities. I think if a storyteller insists on too much suppression of player knowledge, I think there's 2 possible problems you can get into, just generally speaking with role-playing games. One is you might get into player resentment, but what's more likely is you get into player forgetfulness. Players forget what it is they are or aren't supposed to know, and you get these scenes where one of the players blows it and makes a decision or shouts something out to the other players that they forgot they were supposed to forget. And so you can get into difficult and awkward role-playing sessions, and that's why I don't emphasize so strongly to my players, hey, forget everything you know, really, just you don't know what you know. It can cause problems, and that's why in the past I have not demanded it so much of my own players. One of the other things that got me to thinking was, if the Hermetics are so ignorant about the vampires and Tremere specifically, I mean, so ignorant that they think that Tremere vampires are using nodes and using quintessence, etc., wouldn't the Hermetics kind of assume that the Tremere kept their books and their artifacts and their important stuff in Horizon Realms, and the Avatar Storm cut off their access to their Horizon Realms? I mean, so wouldn't the Hermetics start saying, hey, what if all their stuff is blocked even to them, and if we raid their chantries, we won't even find it because it's locked away in the Horizon Realms they can't access? I mean, if you want to push your ignorance that far, you get into questions like that. On page 65, there's a sidebar about vampire stories. I thought that this book, because it had a Vampire the Masquerade logo on the back cover of the book, I thought there would be a little more support for vampires. And this, I guess, is like the Axis Mundi book we looked at. Axis Mundi book had the mage and werewolf logos on the back, but it was really a werewolf book. And then there's like one little sidebar towards the beginning of the book saying, oh yeah, hey, mages, you can use this too, somehow. Go for it. And that's how it was with this book. It was really, really mage-focused, which is not something I'm going to complain about, but there's this sidebar saying, yeah, we admit this book is really, really mage-focused. Not a lot of vampire material here. I thought they should have made it like a 1 or 2 page sidebar and thrown out more ideas for, hey, this is how you can have a vampire focus on this, or if you've got a player group that's 50-50 mages and vampires, you could do ideas like this. I was thinking, wouldn't it be cool if Tremere was like purposefully leaking information, that we've got all this cool stuff that Hermetics want, and then leak a little more information of, this is our location in this city, and goad the Hermetics into attacking places that the Tremere wanted them to attack. And then the Tremere immediately runs to the rest of the Camarilla and says, the mages have declared war on the vampires. We've all got to fight back. What do we do? And then they kick off this great big conflict where all kinds of clans of vampires start whacking mages. And then in the chaos, Tremere can make their moves against the other vampire clans they've been plotting against for so many years. I mean, that's just one idea out of so many that they could have played with. And last off, there's no mention of all of the Sabbat warlocks. The Sabbat is another larger organization in the world of vampire that includes many different factions of vampires, and they have their own kind of diabolic magic that they use, which is not technically thaumaturgy. It's like some other dark magic that they use, and it seems like this would be a good thing to bring into this book, but there really was no mention of Sabbat warlocks. But that about wraps up my thoughts on the general overlook of this book. Coming to the end of this episode, I had a few ideas that I wanted to just toss out there to our listeners if they were thinking of going a bit farther with this. Adventure ideas for Blood Treachery. Number 1. After 2 raids on vampire lairs with high casualties, the players suspect something is wrong. The evidence of diabolic magic found seemed too distant from Hermetic practices. Although Hermetic leaders claim Tremere practices have become corrupt, the players think something is up. Either allied mages or spies give a location from which messengers visited both raided lairs before the raids. If the players investigate, they'll find a Tremere chantry that is manipulating both the Hermetics and a group of vampires that use diabolic blood magic to fight each other. Can the players learn about the Sabbat quickly enough to take advantage of the information? Can they convince Hermetic leadership of the truth? Number 2. After a few skirmishes in the conflict, the players uncover evidence that the young Hermetic leading the conflict in their city is taking vampire blood for herself and her cabal. She's even providing the tainted blood to her acolytes. When it's discovered a Hermetic in the city has knowledge of how to detect mages who have taken vampire blood, the race is on to reach him before the corrupt leader does. The players will fight an uphill battle to bring this to the light before too many mages are sacrificed to the plot. Will the players assault the corrupt leader directly or work to expose her to other mages? Number 3. Each day the players hear more about the approaching raids on Tremere locations. A chance encounter outside a Hermetic chantry in the city alerts the players to technocratic activity. The New World Order has perfected a technique to make fake books and letters that look very old. They have also gained control of Tremere's servants quickly to prepare for the coming conflict. It looks like the technocrats are planning to amplify the conflict to remove 2 of their enemies. If the players move against the Technocracy, Hermetic leadership will oppose them. If they don't, the upcoming conflict with House Tremere will expand into a catastrophic war. Can the players manage their own campaign against the Technocracy in the midst of a conflict with vampires? The lingering question is just how well are the technocrats spying on Council of 9 conferences? So those are my 3 ideas for Blood Treachery. Hopefully those will kick off some ideas of your own. And with that, I'm ready to hear the quote of the book.
It is one of the notes that one of the authors drops in at the end. And this is the author, Stephen Michael DePesa, saying, "If coming into such proximity with the Order has helped to cement anything in my mind, it is that we must elevate ourselves. If we do not, the dream of something better vanishes, replaced by an unending mediocrity and a steady descent towards the lowest common denominator. The world you have been accepting is without any value beyond what you bestow upon it." I like that.
All right. Well, if you have something to say, please contact us at magethepodcast@gmail.com with your questions, comments, or feedback. Whatever they are, we'd like to hear it. Subscribe to Mage the Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, and other sources. If you like the show, others might like it too. And if you leave a review for Mage the Podcast, it makes us more visible in other people's searches. You can follow us on Twitter at Mage the Podcast. We're also on the web at magethepodcast.com. You can listen to past episodes there, see the order in which they aired, and get the great show notes that we put together for you. This episode is thanks to executive producers Ira Grace, Richard Batt Brewster, Jenna F., Andrew Edelstein, Chris Zach, Christopher Phillips, Bryce Perry, Brendan Morrill, Andrew Katz, John Magnuson, Parker, Anders, and Justin. If you would like to become an executive producer for Mage the Podcast, it would help us keep bringing you episodes like this one. You would also become a part of our own council to discuss upcoming projects. The link in the show notes will get you started. Well, until next time, thanks everyone for listening. Until next time, truth until paradox, baby.
What are we reading next, Adam?
Next up is Dragons of the East, which is not actually about dragons. It's about mages, which is good because it's a mage book.
Yeah, and does largely come from an east, depending on where you decide to orient your...
Unless you live in California, then it's Dragons of the West, but hey, what are you going to do?
Or if you're already in Asia, in which case it's Dragons from roughly around here, which wouldn't have been nearly as snappy a title, but yeah. That's the book of Asia? Huh? And with that, bye!